Deepen your understanding of the popular JavaScript framework, Vue.js, to build web applications simply and efficiently with reactive components. Join Evan Yu, open source developer and creator of Vue.js, as he shows you how to build more accessible routing, state management, form validation, and internationalization libraries from the ground up. This course will give you the solid foundation you need to power elegant UI solutions in advanced single-page applications. By coding along with Evan in this workshop, you'll learn how Vue's reactivity system works by implementing a simple version of it, how to use Vue's render functions, and how to author basic patterns for Vue plugins. Evan will also show you how state management patterns such as Vuex and Redux are used in Vue applications, how component-based routing works in Vue applications, and how to code internationalization and form validations into Vue applications. Here's a glimpse of Evan in action.
Hi, I'm Evan Yu, creator of Vue.js. In this course, we're going to talk about advanced use cases and how to build them from ground up in the Vue context. We'll be digging into the reactivity internals of Vue.js, and we'll also be looking at render functions and talk about how to build simple versions of a state management library and a router from the ground up. So after this course, hopefully you'll be able to better understand the nature of these problems and be more confident when you're building big Vue.js applications. I hope you enjoy this course. So we've mentioned that your plugin should look something like this. So we're just going to copy that internal code here. So this install function will be invoked when we call Vue.useRules plugin. This essentially just calls this install function. And we apply the global mixing, which installs a created hook into our component. And we check for rules. And if the rules exist, let's copy over the usage here to see how it actually looks like, right? So look at the shape of this rules object, and we'll notice that it's using keys that corresponding to the data property that we're trying to check and validate. So obviously, it should be able to contain more rules if you want to. So you need to iterate over them. So we'll use the familiar pattern again, object.keys, this.options.rules, for each rule. So for each rule, we have a validate function and a message, right? So we can just destruct it here, in fact. Validate, message. So our line is getting pretty long, but that should be fine. Missing a bracket here. Okay. So now we have validate. Validate a message, and obviously we also have key, right? In fact, what we get here is the key. I'm sorry, we get is the key, and the rule itself is this.options.rules key. Right? This is the actual rule. And I'll just ignore the, there's some syntax error here. OK. All right. So now what we want to do is, for each rule, we want to watch the corresponding property on the instance. Right? So we use this $watch key. If you've never used $watch before, just look it up in the API. This allows us to call a callback whenever this watch property changes. And it takes a callback, which takes a new value. We don't really care about the old value, so we'll just ignore it. So because we have the new value, what we need to do with the new value, the value has changed, right? So the new value, we want to do rule.validate new value. Notice that the validate takes the value and returns a boolean, right? So result, our validation result. So if the result is not true, the validation has failed. And now we need to log the message. And this is pretty much it. So really, this exercise is partially about understanding the boilerplate of how to apply global functionality via a plugin. The other part is know that inside the plugin you can basically do anything. And it's really about knowing what APIs to use to achieve the end result. So a lot of times when you design a plugin, it's probably a good idea to start with the desired API. Think about what would be a good experience if you want others to use the plugin. And then you figure out how you can achieve that goal by going through the existing API surface of Vue, using these low-level primitives, assemble them together inside the plugin to provide some higher-level abstract functionality that can be reused and shared across multiple applications. So this is just a very, very simple example. In fact, in the afternoon, we're going to expand on this one and make it into something actually more useful. If you're using render functions, we don't really need all of that, and we need to implement it ourselves. And the URL handling part is largely the same with last time. window.location.hash/1. And we'll just copy this and update our app URL whenever things change. And the meaty part here is how to figure out which component to use. So let's write the router table. So we can obviously just do this. Pretty straightforward. So just so that it looks more like a route table, let's make the keys strings. And what we want to do here is we still need a root level div if we want to render those links as well. And inside the div, the first thing we want to return is the component, is essentially the router view that we want to render for the current route. And we have the current URL, and we have the route table. So let's just check if the route table contains a component that's matching what we want here. And if there's nothing there, we can simply fall back to the not found component. So this completes the task of finding the corresponding component out of the route table and falling back to the not found if there's nothing matched. And we also need to have the two A-links, I believe. Foo. And copied it with bar. So one thing you may notice if we run this, you notice that there's no space between foo and bar, unlike if you use templates. This is because when you use HTML templates, Vue retains the white space between your elements if there are new lines. This is the same behavior as if you're writing normal HTML. But when you're using render functions, there's no white space node. There's no white space node between the foo and bar. So they're just like close to each other. There's no white space in between. So a lot of people are not used to this when they switch to render functions, and you can either deal with this with CSS, or if you want to, you can just add an empty space in between manually. So this should make it look better. And it switches, and more importantly, let's go to some random URL and it will show not found. So some of the gotchas that you might have run into is if you use like this, you will not be able to access this way, because this is an arrow function, And JavaScript arrow functions will use the this of the outer context. It doesn't have its own this. Okay, so make sure to, if you need this, you always need to use the full function declaration. This is the shorthand. This is just the shorthand of this, if you're not familiar with that. This can be shortened to this. Okay, so but if you're using this normal function declaration, then you need to remember to return it, because you no longer have the implicit return of the arrow functions. So what we need to do, obviously this should accept a tags prop. So we're gonna skip all the other thing, just use the most simple syntax, and so that we can access it inside our render functions. Now you can access this .tags here, and it should be an array of strings. We'll just assume it's always an array of strings, and we'll not care about validation or anything. The cool thing is that we're rendering, so we're rendering a list of the things. Essentially what we want is, we have a root, which is a div, obviously, and it should have a list of children elements. So one easy way to think about this is like, we want something like this. But notice that these tags will be coming from the tags dynamically, and we don't really know how long this array is going to be, right? So you have to construct this children array programmatically. So we can just map it, right? So because it's an array, and const children like this, and we just do this, right? So question is, how do we do this, right? So when we map it, for each tag, we're going to create a corresponding virtual node. So what we'll be returning is an h-call. And obviously, this h-call will just create this tag. And remember, another requirement of for the test to pass is that each of these elements should render the current index in the array. So to get that index, the map function, the iterator passed through the map function takes a second argument, which is the index. As you can see, VS Code is nicely hinting the function syntax for me. And we can use that. We can pass that number directly into the edge function, and we're done. So this is pretty much it. And this is, in fact, we can just copy this here to make it a one-liner. And this should suffice. Let's run a test. And it fails, of course. So, says what? Failed to, oh. Right, because I didn't register the component. Wait, no, I did.
You ran 3.2.
What?
Didn't you run the 3.2 test?
This is the 3.1 test. Okay, yeah. Okay, run test, yes. Actually works, okay. All right, so I hope this sort of gets you sort of familiarized with how render functions work. Everything is just JavaScript. When you need to return something, remember they need to be virtual nodes or text. Or in this case, we can actually pass numbers too. They get casted into strings. And you can optionally omit this data object. And if you want this thing to have attributes, you need to do something like this to give it an ID. So this is all hopefully self-explanatory.
Featuring a clear presentation of well-defined topics, this course is for developers who have some experience with Vue and want to understand its internals better, so they can author their own Vue plugins and use Vue more effectively.